When duty calls a husband away, who fills the void left behind? What happens when a fleeting connection becomes a life-altering mistake? Stay tuned as we dive into this tangled web of passion, betrayal, and regret. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're watching from today. Opening hook. 1,000 words. Military wife's secret romance exposed. Husband's classified job made her regret everything. The letter trembled in my hands, the ink slightly smudged where my tears had landed. It wasn't just a letter. It was a lifeline. My husband, stationed halfway across the world, had poured his heart into every carefully chosen word. He wrote about his long days, the stark desert heat, and how he counted the days until he could hold me again. And yet, as I stood in the glow of the kitchen light, rereading the letter for the third time, guilt threatened to consume me, because while he was dreaming of home, I had shattered it. It all began innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself at the time. Our small military community was tight-knit, and the neighbors often looked out for each other while the men were away. When Daniel moved in next door, I thought nothing of it. A contractor working on renovating the old house he'd purchased. Daniel had the kind of effortless charm that could light up a room. His quick smile and easy conversation were a welcome distraction from the silence that often filled my home when my husband was gone. It started with simple gestures, Daniel offering to mow my lawn while he worked on his, or fixing a loose cabinet door in my kitchen when he borrowed a tool. I didn't think twice about inviting him in for a glass of lemonade after a hot day. After all, what harm could there be in being neighborly? But looking back, I can see the subtle shifts, the way his compliments began to linger, the way his hand would brush mine when he handed me a tool. I noticed the way he'd lean just a little too close, his voice dropping slightly when he spoke to me. And I noticed how I didn't pull away. At first, I chalked it up to loneliness. It was hard being a military wife. Long stretches of silence broken only by letters and the occasional video call. Daniel was a distraction, a way to pass the time, but deep down I knew better. The first real turning point came on a Saturday afternoon. The air was thick with summer heat, and I was struggling to pull weeds from the garden. Daniel appeared, as if on cue, with a pair of gloves and an easy smile. "Need some help?" he asked, and I nodded gratefully. We worked side by side, chatting about everything and nothing, his laughter ringing out whenever I grumbled about the relentless weeds. When we finished, I invited him inside for a drink. As we sat in the living room, the conversation turned more personal. He talked about his failed marriage, his regrets, and how he envied the strong bond my husband and I seemed to have. I remember the way he looked at me then, his blue eyes piercing and filled with something I couldn't quite name. "You're really lucky, you know," he said, his voice low, "to have someone who loves you that much." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. I was lucky my husband adored me, so why did I feel so empty? The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, and then, as if drawn by an invisible force, he reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "I'm sorry," he murmured, pulling back. "I shouldn't have..." But before he could finish, I did something I'll regret for the rest of my life. I leaned forward and kissed him. It was brief, just a brush of lips, but it was enough to set my heart racing. I pulled back, my cheeks flaming, and stammered out an apology. I don't know why I did that," I said, avoiding his gaze. Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he cupped my face in his hands and kissed me again, this time deeper, more urgent. For a moment, I let myself get lost in it, the warmth of his touch, the way he made me feel seen, desired. But as quickly as it began, reality came crashing back. I pushed him away, my chest heaving. "This can't happen," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm married." "I know," he said softly, his gaze steady. "And I'll respect whatever you decide. But I can't pretend I don't feel something for you." His words hung in the air, and I felt the weight of them settle over me. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. He left a few minutes later, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, felt his lips on mine. I told myself it was a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment. It didn't mean anything, but deep down I knew better. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. The next morning I woke to a knock on the door. When I opened it, Daniel stood there, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "I just wanted to apologize," he said, his voice sincere, "for yesterday. I don't want to make things harder for you. I should have closed the door. I should have told him to leave and never come back. But instead, I invited him in." As I placed the flowers in a vase, I felt his eyes on me, the tension between us palpable. When I turned to face him, he was standing closer than I expected, his expression unreadable. "I meant what I said," he said quietly. "I'll respect whatever you want. But if there's even a part of you that feels the same—" I didn't let him finish. I closed the distance between us, my heart pounding. This time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. When he kissed me, it was like a dam breaking, all the loneliness and frustration pouring out at once. As the sun streamed through the windows, I told myself it was just a moment, just one mistake, but even then I knew it was a lie. This was only the beginning. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating the wildflowers Daniel had brought the day before. They sat in a simple glass vase on the counter, a vibrant reminder of my lapse in judgment. I stared at them while sipping my coffee, the bitter taste doing little to calm the turmoil in my chest. I hadn't heard from Daniel since he left the day before, and I was grateful for the silence. It gave me a chance to pretend that nothing had happened, but deep down I knew it was only a matter of time before our paths crossed again. After all, he lived right next door. The day unfolded as usual. I busied myself with errands, laundry, and other mundane tasks, trying to distract myself from the guilt that weighed heavily on my shoulders. Every time I thought of my husband, a pang of shame cut through me. He was thousands of miles away, serving our country, trusting me to hold down the fort while he risked his life. And what had I done? Betrayed him in the worst way possible. By late afternoon, I had convinced myself that the kiss with Daniel was a one-time mistake, a moment of weakness that would never happen again. I was determined to put it behind me and focus on being the wife my husband deserved. But as the hours passed, the ache of loneliness grew stronger. It wasn't just physical absence, it was the emotional distance, the countless nights spent alone with no one to talk to, the weight of carrying everything on my own. My husband and I had always been close, but the long deployments had taken their toll. We had become like pen pals, exchanging letters and video calls, but the intimacy we once shared was a distant memory. That evening, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The summer air was warm, and the faint hum of crickets filled the silence. I stayed on the well-lit sidewalks of our neighborhood, avoiding the path that led past Daniel's house. But as I rounded the corner, I saw him standing in his driveway, tinkering with his. My heart raced as our eyes met. He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, and offered a small smile. "Evening," he said, his voice easy and casual as if nothing had happened. "Hi," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I thought about walking away, pretending I hadn't seen him, but my feet betrayed me. Before I knew it, I was standing a few feet away from him, clutching the strap of my purse like a lifeline. "How's your walk?" he asked, leaning against the truck. The way he looked at me, steady and unguarded, made my stomach twist. "Good," I said quickly. "I should get going." But instead of leaving, I lingered. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he broke it. "Look, About yesterday, he trailed off, running a hand through his hair. I didn't mean to complicate things for you. You didn't, I said quickly, though we both knew it wasn't true. It was my fault too. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. If you want me to back off, I will. I don't want to make this harder for you. I should have said yes. I should have told him to leave me alone, to pretend that nothing had happened between us. But instead, I found myself saying, "It's not that simple." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint chirping of crickets in the distance. Then he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, steady tone. "It doesn't have to be complicated," he said. "I'm not asking for anything from you, but if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." His words hung in the air, and I felt my resolve faltering. I wanted to believe him, to think that we could somehow navigate this without it spiraling out of control, but deep down, I knew it was a dangerous game. "I should go," I said again, my voice shaking. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, my heart pounding with every step. The next few days passed in a blur. I threw myself into household chores, trying to keep my mind occupied, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of Daniel, the way he looked at me, the way his touch made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I started avoiding the living room where the vase of wildflowers sat like a silent witness to my guilt. Every time I saw them, I was reminded of the line I had crossed. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, the doorbell rang. My stomach twisted as I walked to the door, half expecting to see Daniel standing on the porch. But when I opened it, it was my friend Lisa, her cheerful smile a welcome distraction. "Hey, stranger," she said, pulling me into a hug. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. I forced a smile, trying to mask the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "It's good to see you," I said, stepping aside to let her in. We settled in the kitchen, sipping iced tea and catching up on each other's lives. Lisa's husband was also in the military, and we had bonded over the shared challenges of being military wives. But as she talked about her plans for their upcoming anniversary, I felt a pang of envy. Her marriage seemed so solid, so unshaken by the distance that often strained relationships like ours. "Are you okay?" Lisa asked, her brow furrowing with concern. "You seem distracted." "I'm fine," I said quickly, avoiding her gaze. "Just tired, I guess." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "If you ever need to talk, you know I'm here, right?" I nodded, my throat tightening. "Thanks, Lisa." After she left, I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window at Daniel's house. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint glow of a lamp in the living room. I thought about his offer, his promise to be there if I needed someone to talk to, and despite my better judgment, I felt a pull, a magnetic force that I couldn't seem to resist. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced with conflicting emotions. I thought about my husband, about the sacrifices he was making, about the life we had built together, and then I thought about Daniel, about the way he made me feel seen, heard, understood. I knew I was standing at a crossroads. One path led back to the life I had vowed to honor and protect. The other was uncharted territory, filled with danger and uncertainty. And yet, as the hours ticked by and the silence of the house grew heavier, I found myself wondering if it was already too late to turn back. The rain began late in the afternoon, a sudden summer storm rolling in and turning the sky an ominous shade of gray. By early evening, the rain had intensified, sheets of water drumming against the windows as thunder rumbled in the distance. I sat on the couch with a book in my lap. Though I hadn't turned a page in nearly an hour, my mind was elsewhere, tangled in a web of guilt and temptation. I tried to distract myself by texting my husband, It was early morning where he was stationed, and I knew he'd just be starting his day. But as I typed out a message, I hesitated, staring at the blinking cursor. What could I say that wouldn't feel hollow? How could I tell him I missed him when I'd been thinking of another man? A sharp knock at the door jolted me from my thoughts. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment I considered ignoring it. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. Slowly, I set the book aside and made my way to the door. When I opened it, Daniel stood on the porch, soaked to the bone. Rain dripped from his dark hair and his shirt clung to his chest, the fabric translucent from the downpour. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I was working in the yard when the storm hit, and the power's out at my place. Thought I'd see if yours was out too." I stared at him for a moment, torn between slamming the door and inviting him in. But the sight of him standing there, shivering and drenched, tugged at something deep inside me. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. He hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether he should, but then he nodded and stepped inside. Water pooled on the floor where he stood, and I grabbed a towel from the laundry basket in the corner, handing it to him. "Thanks," he said, rubbing the towel over his hair. "Sorry for the mess." "It's fine," I said quickly, my voice unsteady. "You didn't have to come all the way over here." He shrugged, his eyes meeting mine. "Didn't think you'd mind." The air between us felt heavy, charged. I forced myself to look away, busying myself with tidying up the already spotless living room. "Do you want some coffee or tea?" I asked, my back turned to him. "You must be freezing." "Coffee would be great," he said. I busied myself in the kitchen, the sound of the rain pounding against the roof a constant backdrop. I could feel his presence behind me, even though he wasn't saying a word. When I turned to hand him the mug, he was closer than I expected, his eyes locked on mine. "Thanks," he said, taking the mug from me. His fingers brushed mine, sending a jolt up my arm. I took a step back, trying to put some distance between us. "So, how's the renovation going?" I asked, desperate to fill the silence. "Good," he said, setting the mug on the counter. "But it's lonely over there. Too quiet." The way he said it, his voice low and laced with meaning, made my pulse quicken. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He took a step closer, closing the gap between us. "Listen," he said, his voice soft. "If this is too much, if you want me to leave—" "No," I said quickly, surprising even myself. "You don't have to go." His gaze searched mine as if looking for permission, and then, slowly, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. His touch was gentle, hesitant, as though he was afraid I might pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. The moment hung in the air, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. And then, before I could stop myself, I leaned in. The kiss started softly, a tentative meeting of lips that sent a shiver down my spine. But it quickly deepened, the weeks of unspoken tension between us exploding in a rush of heat and urgency. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself melt into him, my fingers tangling in his dance. For a moment, nothing else existed. Not the storm raging outside, not the guilt gnawing at the edges of my mind, not the vows I had made to my husband. It was just him and me, and the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. But reality came crashing back as his hands slid to the hem of my shirt. I pulled away, my chest heaving, and took a shaky step back. "I can't do this," I stammered, my voice barely audible. Daniel's eyes searched mine, a mixture of longing and regret. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I didn't mean to push you." "It's not your fault," I said quickly. This was a mistake." But even as I said the words, I couldn't deny the part of me that wanted to keep going, to lose myself in him and forget everything else. He nodded, stepping back and running a hand through his hair. "I'll go," he said. "But if you ever change your mind—" He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he turned and walked to the door, his shoulders slumped. I watched him go, my heart pounding in my chest, and as the door clicked shut behind him, a wave of guilt crashed over me. I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. What had I done? How could I have let it get this far? The storm outside seemed to mirror the chaos inside me, the rain lashing against the windows like a punishment. I told myself it would never happen again, that I would find a way to set things right. But even as I made the promise, I knew it was a lie. Because when Daniel kissed me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, and no matter how much I tried to deny it, I knew I wasn't ready to let it go. The storm passed by morning, but it left behind a charged stillness in the air that mirrored my own emotions. I woke up feeling raw, my thoughts jumbled and tangled like a web. Daniel's kiss lingered in my mind, as vivid as if it had just happened. The memory of it was intoxicating, but the guilt that followed was suffocating. I told myself over and over that it had been a moment of weakness, that it wouldn't happen again, and for a few days I believed it. I threw myself into a routine, trying to keep myself too busy to think. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, caught up on errands I'd been neglecting, and spent hours writing to my husband, pouring my heart into the letters as if they could erase the sin I'd committed. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, my thoughts always wandered back to Daniel. The wildflowers he had brought me were still sitting on the kitchen counter. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away, even though every time I looked at them, I felt a pang of guilt. It was as if they were a symbol of the line I had crossed, a constant reminder of the man who had made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. I told myself I wouldn't see him again, I would avoid him at all costs, but the universe seemed determined to test my resolve. It started innocently enough. I was sitting on the porch one evening, sipping tea and enjoying the warm breeze, when I saw him jogging down the street. His t-shirt clung to his chest, damp with sweat, and his hair was tousled from the run. He caught sight of me and slowed to a stop, his hands resting on his knees as he caught his breath. "Hey," he said, his voice breathless but warm. I forced a smile, my heart pounding. "Hey, didn't mean to interrupt," he said, gesturing to the book in my lap. "Just thought I'd say hi." I nodded, my throat dry. No interruption. There was a moment of silence, and then he straightened, running a hand through his hair. "Look, about the other night." "You don't have to say anything," I interrupted quickly. "It was a mistake. It shouldn't have happened." He hesitated, his expression unreadable. "Do you really believe that?" I didn't know how to answer. My mind screamed yes, but my heart whispered no. And in that moment, with the setting sun casting a golden glow over him, I felt my resolve weaken. "I have to go," I said, standing abruptly. "Good night, Daniel." I didn't wait for his response. I turned and went inside, closing the door behind me. But even as I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breathing, I knew this wasn't over. The next time it happened, it was my fault. At least, that's what I told myself. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and I was in the backyard trimming the overgrown hedges. The sun was beating down, and sweat clung to my skin as I worked. I was so focused on the task that I didn't hear him approach. "Need a hand?" I jumped, turning to see Daniel standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets and a faint smile on his lips. "I'm fine," I said quickly, wiping my forehead with the back of my hand. "You sure?" he asked, stepping closer. "That looks like a lot of work." I hesitated, my resolve wavering. "It's just the hedges." "Well, let me help," he said, taking the clippers from my hands before I could protest. I stood there, frozen, as he started trimming the hedges with practiced ease. I told myself to go inside, to put some distance between us, but I couldn't seem to move. Instead, I watched him, the way his muscles flexed as he worked, the way the sunlight caught the strands of his hair. My heart was pounding, and I felt a familiar heat rising in my chest. When he finished, he turned to me, his smile soft and genuine. "All done." "Thanks," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He took a step closer, his eyes searching mine. "Are you okay?" I nodded, even though I wasn't. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't ignore. And then, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. The kiss was different this time. It wasn't tentative or hesitant. It was hungry, desperate, as if we were both trying to drown out the world and everything that came with it. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt my resolve crumble completely. I didn't stop him when he guided me toward the house. I didn't stop him when we crossed the threshold, the cool air inside doing nothing to quell the heat between us. And I didn't stop him when he led me to the couch, his lips never leaving mine. After that day, everything changed. We tried to keep our distance, but it was impossible. Every time I saw him, every time our paths crossed, the pull was too strong. We found excuses to see each other. A forgotten tool, a question about the renovations, a shared cup of coffee on the porch. Each time, we promised ourselves it would be the last. The guilt never went away. It gnawed at me constantly, a dark cloud hanging over every moment. But no matter how much I hated myself for what I was doing, I couldn't stop. With Daniel, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. He made me laugh, made me feel seen, made me forget the loneliness that had become my constant companion. But it wasn't just about the way he made me feel. It was about the way he looked at me, as if I were the only person in the world. The way he listened to me, really listened, in a way that made me feel valued and understood. It was intoxicating, and I was addicted. We became reckless. We met in his house, in mine, in places where we could be seen. We told ourselves it was safe, that no one would suspect anything, but deep down, I knew we were playing with fire. One evening, as we lay tangled together on his couch, he turned to me, his expression serious. "What are we doing?" he asked, his voice quiet. I didn't know how to answer. I had asked myself the same question countless times, but I still didn't have an answer. "This can't last," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "You know that, right?" "I know," I said, my throat tightening, "but I don't know how to stop." He nodded, his gaze distant. "Me neither." For a moment we sat in silence, the weight of our actions pressing down on us. And then, as if by unspoken agreement, we kissed again, desperate to forget the inevitable. The first crack in our fragile facade came a week later. My friend Lisa stopped by unexpectedly, catching me off guard. As we chatted in the living room, her eyes fell on the vase of wildflowers still sitting on the counter. "Those are beautiful," she said, smiling. "Where'd you get them?" I hesitated, the lie catching in my throat. "Oh, just from the garden," I said quickly, avoiding her gaze. She nodded, seemingly satisfied, but I could feel her eyes on me, studying me, and in that moment I realized how precarious my situation had become. The unraveling began on a Tuesday evening, a day so ordinary that I never saw it coming. The early autumn sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner. My husband had sent an email earlier in the day, mentioning he might be able to call that night if his schedule allowed. I had spent all afternoon cleaning the house, as if scrubbing the floors could somehow absolve me of my guilt, but the weight of my actions lingered, pressing down on me like an unbearable burden. I heard a knock at the door and froze, my heart instantly racing. My hands instinctively wiped themselves on the kitchen towel, though they weren't damp, and I forced myself to move. When I opened the door, Daniel stood there, his face betraying a mixture of urgency and hesitation. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. I stepped aside, letting him in without a word. My stomach churned as I closed the door, the soft click of the latch feeling like the tolling of a bell. Daniel's presence filled the room, his tension palpable. He wasn't his usual confident self. Instead, his shoulders were hunched, and his jaw was tight. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing in the small space between the living room and the kitchen. "I think someone saw us," he finally said. The blood drained from my face. "What do you mean?" Daniel stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression grim. "When we met at my place the other day, one of the neighbors might have seen you leaving." My chest tightened and I gripped the edge of the counter for support. "How do you know?" "They didn't say anything directly," he said quickly. "But Mrs. Simmons, the one who lives across the street, she made a comment about how busy you've been lately, and the way she said it, I don't know, it didn't feel innocent." Panic surged through me, my thoughts racing. Mrs. Simmons was the neighborhood gossip, always watching, always talking. If she suspected anything, it wouldn't be long before the entire street knew. "This can't happen," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "If she tells anyone." "She won't," Daniel interrupted, his tone firm. "Even if she suspects something, she doesn't have proof." But his reassurance did little to calm me. The walls seemed to close in around me as the reality of the situation sank in. We had been careless, reckless, and now the consequences were catching up with us. "You should go," I said suddenly, my voice sharp. "We shouldn't be seen together." "Wait," Daniel said, stepping closer. "We need to figure out what we're going to do. If she starts talking—" "There is no we," I snapped, cutting him off. Whatever this is, it has to stop. Now." Daniel flinched at my words, but he didn't argue. He nodded slowly, his expression clouded with regret. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll stay away." For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence between us was deafening, filled with all the things we couldn't say. And then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. I stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the closed door, as if it could somehow erase everything that had happened. But the damage was already done. That night, as I was finishing the dishes, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was my husband, his name lighting up the screen. My heart leapt with relief and dread all at once. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered, trying to steady my voice. "Hi, honey," I said, forcing a smile even though he couldn't see me. "Hey," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "I wasn't sure I'd catch you. How are things?" "Good," I said quickly. "Everything's fine." There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear the faint hum of background noise. Voices, machinery, the sounds of a distant place I couldn't picture. "You sure?" he asked. "You sound off." "I'm just tired," I said, laughing nervously. "You know how it is." He didn't respond right away, and I felt a bead of sweat trickle down the back of my neck. "I miss you," he said finally, his voice soft. "I miss you too," I replied, and for the first time in weeks, the words felt genuine. But as we talked, the guilt gnawed at me, every word feeling like a lie. He told me about his day, about the challenges of his work, and I listened, nodding and murmuring responses. But my mind was elsewhere, consumed by the mess I had made of our marriage. When the call ended, I sat on the couch, staring at the phone in my hand. The weight of my actions pressed down on me, suffocating and inescapable. I had betrayed the man who loved me, the man who trusted me. And for what? A fleeting connection, a selfish need to fill the void his absence had left. The final blow came 2 days later. I was in the backyard, hanging laundry on the line, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Lisa, her expression serious. "We need to talk," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. I felt my stomach drop. "What's going on?" Lisa crossed her arms, her gaze piercing. "I've heard some things, and I need to know if they're true." "Things?" I echoed, my voice shaking. "About you and Daniel," she said bluntly. "Mrs. Simmons has been talking, and, well, it doesn't look good." My blood turned to ice. "Lisa, it's not what you think." "And what is it?" she demanded. "Because right now, it looks like you're risking everything for a fling with the guy next door." Her words hit me like a slap, and I felt tears sting my eyes. "It's not like that," I said weakly, but even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. Lisa shook her head, her expression a mix of anger and disappointment. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? To yourself? To your husband? He doesn't deserve this." "I know," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I know." "Then end it," she said firmly. "Before it's too late." She left without another word, and I sank onto the porch steps, my head in my hands. The walls were closing in, and I had no one to blame but myself. That evening, I called Daniel. The phone rang twice before he picked up, his voice cautious. "Hello?" "We need to end this," I said, my voice trembling. For good this time. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me otherwise. "Okay," he said softly. "If that's what you want." "It's not about what I want," I said, tears streaming down my face. "It's about what's right." The line went quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Take care of yourself." "You too," I whispered before hanging up. I sat in the darkness for a long time after that, the weight of my choices crashing down on me. I had reached the point of no return, and the only thing left to do was face the consequences. The fallout came sooner than I expected. It was the evening after I had told Daniel it was over. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the dishwasher, and I was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the television. My husband's next email was open on my phone, the words blurring together as guilt churned in my stomach. I had written him back earlier in the day, pouring as much love and reassurance into my message as I could muster. But no amount of sweet words could erase what I had done. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the clock. It was too late for any deliveries, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart leapt into my throat as I moved to the window, peeking through the curtains. It was my husband's car. Panic gripped me as I watched him step out, his uniformed figure illuminated by the porch light. He wasn't supposed to be home for another 2 months. My mind raced, trying to make sense of why he was here. Had something happened? Was he hurt? Or worse, had he found out? I barely had time to compose myself before the door swung open. There he stood, his face weary but smiling as he dropped his duffel bag to the floor. "Surprise," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "You're home," I stammered, my pulse racing. I rushed to him, wrapping my arms around him, the scent of his cologne and the solid warmth of his body overwhelming me. For a brief moment, relief flooded through me, and I clung to him as if that could erase everything. He pulled back slightly, his hands resting on my shoulders as he studied me. "I thought you'd be happy to see me," he said with a chuckle, but his eyes searched mine, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "I just wasn't expecting you." "I got some leave," he explained. "Wanted to surprise you. Figured I'd spend a couple of weeks at home before heading back." "That's wonderful," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It's so good to have you home." But even as I said the words, I felt the walls closing in around me. He had no idea that the home he was returning to wasn't the one he had left. The guilt that had been gnawing at me for weeks threatened to consume me, but I pushed it down, determined to make it through the evening. The first cracks appeared over dinner. We sat at the kitchen table, the soft glow of the overhead light casting a warm ambiance. I had thrown together a simple meal, my nerves too frayed to focus on anything elaborate. He seemed happy, relaxed, talking about his time overseas and the friends he had made. I listened, nodding and smiling in all the right places, but my mind was elsewhere. And then he said something that made my heart stop. "So, I ran into Mrs. Simmons when I pulled in," he said casually, taking a sip of his drink. "She said you've been keeping busy." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. "Oh," I said, my voice too high, too strained. "Yeah," he said, his tone light. "She mentioned seeing you out and about a lot lately. Said you've had a visitor now and then." The words hung in the air and I felt my stomach drop. I forced myself to take a bite of food, chewing mechanically as I tried to gather my thoughts. "He's always been nosy," I said finally, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. "You know how she is." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment too long. "Yeah, she's got a way of sticking her nose where it doesn't belong." I laughed nervously, but the sound felt hollow. The conversation moved on, but the tension lingered, an unspoken question hanging between us. Later that night, as we lay in bed, the confrontation I had been dreading finally came. I was staring at the ceiling, my body rigid with tension, when he spoke. "Something's different," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I turned to look at him, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" He propped himself up on one elbow, his gaze piercing. You've been acting off ever since I walked through the door." "I'm just surprised, that's all," I said quickly. "I wasn't expecting you." "Surprised?" he repeated, his brow furrowing. "Or nervous?" My breath caught and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know," he said, his tone sharper now. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. You're distant, jumpy, and when I mentioned Mrs. Simmons earlier, you looked like you'd seen a ghost." "I told you," I said, sitting up and crossing my arms. "She's just being nosy, there's nothing to it." "Is there?" he asked, his voice low. "Because the way you're acting right now doesn't make me feel like you're being honest." A wave of anger rose in me, defensive and desperate. "I don't know what you want me to say." "I want the truth," he snapped, sitting up now as well. "Is there something you're not telling me? Because I swear, if I find out you've been—" "Stop," I interrupted, my voice breaking. "Don't say it." His expression shifted, a mixture of anger and pain crossing his face. "Why not? Is it true?" The silence that followed was deafening. I couldn't look at him, my eyes fixed on the pattern of the bedspread. My hands trembled and I clenched them into fists, trying to steady myself. The word caught in my throat and I swallowed hard. "I made a mistake." His sharp intake of breath cut through the silence, and when I finally looked at him, the devastation in his eyes was unbearable. "Ooh," he demanded, his voice shaking. "Was it someone I know?" "Oh, it doesn't matter," I said quickly. "It's over, it meant nothing." "Nothing," he repeated, his voice rising. "You betrayed me, and you're telling me it meant nothing?" Tears streamed down my face as I tried to explain, to justify the unjustifiable. "I was lonely," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You were gone, and I wasn't thinking." "That's your excuse," he said, his tone laced with bitterness. "I'm risking my life overseas, and you can't handle being alone for a few months?" "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," he said, his voice breaking. "You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed everything." His words cut deeper than I thought possible, and I felt my chest tighten with the weight of his pain. For a moment, I thought he might leave, grab his bag and walk out the door. But instead, he turned away, his shoulders shaking as he struggled to contain his emotions. "I need some air," he said finally, his voice strained. Without another word, he got up and left the room, the sound of the front door slamming echoing through the house. I sat there in the darkness, the silence pressing down on me. The confrontation I had been dreading was over, but the aftermath was only beginning. I had broken something that could never be fixed, and now I had to live with the consequences. The front door echoed through the house as it slammed shut, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence. My hands trembled as I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the rumpled sheets that just hours ago had felt like a sanctuary. Now they were a battlefield, a space where the truth had spilled out like a wound, raw and unhealed. I couldn't move. My chest was tight, my breath shallow. The weight of his absence was heavier than anything I had ever felt. Minutes turned into hours, but I stayed rooted in place, replaying the confrontation in my mind. His voice, thick with anger and betrayal, echoed in my ears. The pain in his eyes was seared into my memory. I couldn't unsee it, couldn't unhear it. I knew I had destroyed him. I had destroyed us. When I finally managed to pull myself from the bed, the house felt foreign, as if it no longer belonged to me. I wandered into the kitchen, hoping to find some clarity in the mundane tasks of cleaning or tidying, but everything felt meaningless. My gaze fell on the vase of wildflowers on the counter, their petals starting to wilt. I reached for them, but my hand froze halfway. Throwing them away wouldn't erase what they represented. The sound of the front door opening startled me. I spun around, my heart pounding, and saw him standing in the doorway. His face was unreadable, his eyes red-rimmed and tired. He had been gone for hours, and the night had deepened into a quiet, oppressive darkness. "I didn't think you'd come back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his shoulders slumping. "Neither did I," he admitted. We stood there in silence, the distance between us feeling like a chasm. I wanted to run to him, to beg for forgiveness, but I knew better. Words couldn't fix this. Neither could proximity. I had to wait, to let him lead, even if that meant facing the possibility that he might walk away for good. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice cracking. "Why did you do it?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded with pain. I searched for an answer, but none of the excuses I had rehearsed in my mind felt adequate. "I don't know," I said, my throat tight. "I was lonely, I was angry, and I was selfish." "Selfish?" he repeated, his tone bitter. He crossed the room, standing a few feet away from me, his eyes locked on mine. "You think that justifies it? You think that makes it okay?" "No," I said quickly, tears welling up again. "It doesn't. Nothing does." "I know that." He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw clenched. "Do you love him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said, shaking my head vehemently. "It wasn't about that. It was never about love." "Then what was it about?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What was worth throwing everything away for? What was worth destroying us?" I couldn't answer. How could I? How could I explain the emptiness, the loneliness, the way I had let my resentment fester until it consumed me? How could I explain that I had made a mistake, not because I didn't love him, but because I had forgotten how to love myself? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I don't know." He turned away, running a hand through his hair, and I saw the tension in his shoulders. "I thought I knew you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought we were stronger than this." "How did I?" I whispered. The room fell silent again, the weight of our broken trust pressing down on both of us. I wanted to reach out to him, to hold him, but I knew I had no right. Not anymore. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Tell me and I'll do it, whatever it takes." He turned back to me, his expression filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I don't know if there's anything you can do," he said. "I don't even know if I can forgive you." The words cut deep, but I nodded. "I understand." "Do you?" he asked sharply. Do you understand what it feels like to be betrayed by the one person you thought you could trust completely? To wonder if anything we had was real? It was real, I said quickly, my voice desperate. It is real. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But it doesn't change how much I love you. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Love? You call this love? I don't know what else to call it, I said, tears streaming down my face. But I do love you. I always have. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, and for a moment I thought he might say something. But instead he turned and walked past me, heading for the stairs. Where are you going? I asked, my voice trembling. I need to think, he said without looking back. I watched him disappear upstairs, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the house. When the bedroom door closed behind him, I sank onto the couch, my body shaking with sobs. The weight of what I had done pressed down on me, suffocating and inescapable. I had no idea if he would ever be able to forgive me, and if he couldn't, I couldn't blame him. The days that followed were a blur. He stayed, but it was as if he wasn't really there. We moved through the house like strangers, exchanging only the bare minimum of words. The tension was palpable, the silence deafening. I tried to give him space, to let him process everything, but the uncertainty was excruciating. One evening, as we sat in the living room, the silence between us was finally broken. I've been thinking, he said, his voice quiet but steady. I looked up from my hands, my heart racing. About what? About us, he said. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said finally. Not yet, maybe not ever, but I'm not ready to give up on us. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I nodded. I'll do whatever it takes, I said, my voice trembling. I'll go to counseling. Stop, he said, holding up a hand. This isn't something we can fix overnight. It's going to take time, a lot of time. I'll wait, I said quickly, for as long as it takes. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with pain but also a glimmer of hope. We'll see, he said. But if we're going to try, you have to be honest with me. No more secrets. I promise, I said, my voice thick with emotion. No more secrets. He nodded, his expression still guarded. Then, let's take it one day at a time. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. The days that followed our fragile truce were a mix of hope and uncertainty. Every step forward felt tentative, like walking on cracked ice that could give way at any moment. He stayed, but the distance between us remained, an invisible barrier that I wasn't sure either of us knew how to cross. We spoke in careful tones, measured words that avoided the deep wounds still festering between us. I spent my days reflecting on everything I had done, trying to understand how I had allowed myself to fall so far. It was easy to blame the loneliness, the months of feeling like a single woman in a married life, or the resentment I had felt over his absence. But the truth was more complicated than that. Somewhere along the way, I had let my own unhappiness fester, turning it into a justification for something I knew was wrong. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in the backyard, staring at the garden I had once taken such pride in. The hedges were trimmed neatly now, Daniel had helped me with that, and the memory sent a pang of regret through me. It was strange how something as mundane as a pair of hedge clippers could symbolize so much. I had let myself be swept away by the thrill of something new, by the feeling of being seen and wanted. But what I hadn't considered was the cost. I picked up a trowel and started digging in the soil, hoping the physical act of gardening would give me some clarity. The earth was cool and soft beneath my hands, the scent of it grounding me. As I worked, I thought about my husband, about the sacrifices he had made for us, for our life together. He had given me everything, his love, his loyalty, his trust, and I had taken it for granted. I had repaid his devotion with betrayal, and now I was left to wonder if I would ever earn back what I had so carelessly thrown away. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the street. His posture was relaxed, but his face was heavy with thought. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if he wanted company. But then he glanced back at me and gave a small nod, an invitation I didn't deserve but couldn't refuse. I stepped outside and sat down beside him, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. For a while, neither of us spoke. The quiet was almost comforting, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice low. "About what?" I asked, bracing myself for whatever was coming. "About us," he said, turning to look at me. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of pain and resolve. "And about what happens next." I nodded, my throat tightening. "I know it's going to take time, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." "It's not just about time," he said, shaking his head. "It's about trust, about rebuilding something that feels impossible to rebuild." "I understand," I said softly, though I wasn't sure I truly did. How could I? I had been the one to break it, not him. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been asking myself if we can even get back to what we had, if it's worth trying." My heart clenched at his words, but I forced myself to stay calm. "And what do you think?" "I think—" He paused, his gaze drifting back to the street. "I think we owe it to ourselves to try. But it's going to be hard, and I need to know that you're willing to fight for this. Not just say you are, but really fight." "I am," I said, my voice steady. "I don't know how to prove it to you, but I'll find a way." He nodded slowly, as if weighing my words. "You already started by telling me the truth," he said. "That couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," I admitted, "but it was the least I could do." For a moment we sat in silence again, the weight of the conversation hanging between us. And then, to my surprise, he reached out and took my hand. His grip was firm, grounding, and I felt a flicker of hope ignite in my chest. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you," he said quietly, "but I want to try. For us. For what we used to be." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I nodded, squeezing his hand. "Thank you," I whispered. "I don't deserve it, but thank you." The following days were filled with small steps. We started having dinner together again, talking about ordinary things: work, friends, the house. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something. I began to notice little moments of softness in him, small gestures that reminded me of the man I had fallen in love with. They gave me hope, even as I knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. I also started going to therapy, something I had resisted for years. It wasn't easy to sit in front of a stranger and unpack the mess I had made of my life, but I knew it was necessary. I had to understand myself before I could hope to fix what I had broken. My therapist helped me see patterns I hadn't recognized before, the ways I had let resentment build up, the unrealistic expectations I had placed on my husband, the ways I had avoided addressing my own unhappiness. She didn't excuse my actions, but she helped me understand them, and that understanding was a step toward healing. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, I glanced over at him and saw a hint of the man he used to be. He was laughing at something on the screen, his face relaxed for the first time in weeks. I realized then how much I had taken those moments for granted, the easy laughter, the shared joy, and I vowed to never take them for granted again. After the movie ended, I turned to him, my heart pounding. "I just want you to know," I said softly, "how much I love you, and how sorry I am." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression serious. Then he nodded. "I know," he said, And I love you too. It wasn't a grand gesture or a sweeping declaration, but it was enough. Reflection had taught me many things. I had learned that love isn't just about passion or connection, it's about commitment, about choosing each other even when things get hard. I had learned that trust, once broken, takes time and effort to rebuild. And I had learned that forgiveness, whether given or sought, is a journey, not a destination. Most of all, I had learned that healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about moving forward, one small step at a time, and hoping that each step brings you closer to something better. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves as I stepped onto the porch. The sky was streaked with the fading hues of sunset, a quiet beauty that seemed to mirror the fragile peace that had settled over my home. My husband was in the living room, his voice drifting softly through the open window as he spoke on a call with a friend. It was the first time in weeks that I'd heard him laugh, a sound that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. I wrapped my sweater tighter around me, leaning against the porch railing. The house behind me felt different now, a space that carried both the weight of what had happened and the promise of what might still be possible. The cracks in our relationship were still there, visible and raw, but we had started to patch them, one careful moment at a time. I thought back to the day I had told him everything, how his face had shattered with the weight of betrayal. I remembered the nights that followed, the silence between us so heavy it felt like it might swallow me whole. But I also remembered the way he had taken my hand on the porch, the way he had said he was willing to try. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a chance. The therapy sessions had become my anchor. Each week I peeled back another layer of myself, uncovering the fears and insecurities I had buried for years. I was learning to sit with the discomfort, to confront the parts of me that I had ignored for so long. My therapist reminded me that healing wasn't linear, that there would be setbacks, but every step forward was progress. My husband and I had started attending couples therapy together. The sessions were hard, filled with uncomfortable truths and moments of vulnerability that left us both emotionally drained, but they were also necessary. Each conversation, no matter how painful, was a step toward rebuilding the foundation we had lost. I knew we had a long way to go. There were still nights when he slept on the couch, moments when a passing glance turned into a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. But there were also glimmers of hope, shared laughter, quiet dinners, and the way his hand lingered on mine just a little longer each time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I closed my eyes and breathed in the cool evening air. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not the naive kind, but the kind that grows from hard work and quiet determination. When I turned to go back inside, my husband was standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the warm glow of the living room. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. We were still here. And that was enough.